G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic end to your week. I hope that you have a great weekend planned ahead of you. Now today we do have a lot to talk about as always. So we need to talk about F-16s, potentially some fabricated doctored images. We need to talk about Ukraine working in Africa, oil between the EU and Russia, of course, what is passing through Ukraine. We need to talk about the largest prisoner swap we have seen in many, many years between Russia and the US, what they are saying about this, and maybe what we think about this. But where I want to start is I actually want to start on the maps straight off the bat. So of course, here is Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas have been occupied by Russia since 2022, the purple since 2014. The red check is Russian territory made within the past 24 hours, and the blue is Ukrainian ground taken back off the Russians within the past 2 weeks. Now, where I want to come down into is then to Avdiivka, but I want to show you something else before we look at some specifics in here. Now, I always try and do one of these, and it's like a monthly roundup of what ground has changed and what that may be telling us on the ground. Now, of course, we have different maps we look over and they can tell a different picture. Now, what one of my guys has got for me, and it's fantastic that he's done this, is he shows the difference between War Mapper and Deep State maps and show what changes that they are showing month to month. So look, the purpose of this video, we are looking at 2024. Now, what I always say, and these numbers show this, is that I always say War Mapper is very, very conservative towards any Russian gain. And these numbers, they tell that story between the Ukrainian Deep State map and then War Mapper here as well. And that can be for a number of reasons due to a lack of geolocations as well. But you'll see that July isn't filled in. That's because July's number has only just come out. Now, July was 177.22 squared kilometers that Russia has got over the past month. So I think it is catching up on potentially some of the geolocations from then the months before. So that is interesting to look at how much ground is being made. But we need to step, I guess, one step back and have a look over the length of the war and where ground has and hasn't been made. So the left-hand column where I've put these red brackets, this is Ukraine making back ground, and the red, this is Russia making ground. So you can see in the beginning of the war, of course, huge amounts made. Then Ukraine took back a hell of a lot, primarily around, say, Kyiv, and then Russia continued this grind through 2022 in the beginning. The end of 2022, this is when, and the numbers back up that I'm correct when I said Ukraine had the most amount of success on offensive action was right here. When the West should have stepped in to help Ukraine with everything was at this point. Russia had huge losses in the beginning. They were struggling to replace those losses. They were on the back foot. That was, I believe, we will look back historically and say that was Ukraine's best chance at that point, because Soviet-Russian doctrine, it basically says the longer the war goes on, the more experience it then has in the ranks. That the Western doctrine is we need to win wars quickly, violently, and with massive maneuver, with very technical, highly trained soldiers, where the Soviet doctrine sort of works differently, that we're going to have just massive, massive losses, and over years, eventually we'll start then gaining that experience and we'll grind through. So that is the difference, that the West will either win quickly and lose slowly, where the Russians will either lose quickly or win very slowly, if that makes sense. I know it is far, far more complex than that. It is simplifying something massively, but the Soviet doctrine can allow for massive, massive losses. And that is some of what we are seeing here. Anyway, so this is where Ukraine had those huge swaths of land through Kharkiv and Kyiv. And at this point here, this is the point at which Ukraine actually had liberated, since the beginning of the war, the most amount of territory. Now, I know he's a controversial figure, but John Mearsheimer, the professor, he believes that right here, and he puts it as, I think he calls it the high water line of when negotiations should have then been made. Anyway, we see the beginning of 2023. We then see this was around then the Bakhmut time where Russia had that grinding, very costly movements through. Of course, a lot, though, was taken by Wagner PMC, what allowed Russia in the back to train and replenish the military forces that had huge losses in the beginning. Now, we see through mid-23, this was the famed, infamous, I'll say, Ukrainian counter-offensive over these months. And you can see the largest month was month 2, and then the petering out of this over at a maximum of 0.04%. That is not of occupied territory, that is of total Ukrainian territory. And then we can see at the end of 2023, Russia made back some small amounts of ground, but then in 2024, we can see then Russia on the offensive here. Now, actually, something I missed was 2023, basically to very close, had a net zero change. This is why I talk about this high water line at the end of 22. Now, over this year, we have seen Russia's grind away, and the largest month being in May, and then the second largest actually being in July, the month just passed. So it is interesting to look at this and how things are changing on the front line as this war does evolve. Now, a very interesting part, and this will be highly, highly relevant when it comes to peace negotiations, diplomatic actions, if that goes ahead this year, which the more I'm seeing, the more I'm just sort of thinking it may, but I'm unsure. So this is War Mapper. So again, he's very conservative towards Russian gains. So likely these numbers are higher, but for the sake of the video, it makes sense. So Russian control of oblasts: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Zap, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Crimea. So what we can see here is 58.5% that Russia occupy of Donetsk, 98.3% of Luhansk, 2% of Kharkiv, 72% of Zap, 71.8% of Kherson, basically none of Mykolaiv, and all of Crimea. Now, the reason I bring this up is what Russia's demands were before the last peace conference was of not all, but some of these oblasts, that they take then 100% of it, and then peace ensures. Now, what I have then spoken about with negotiations is the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That is the primary factor that Ukraine is going into this with. And we have seen only from yesterday and from, the Finnish president or other leaders saying that Ukraine needs all this land back and Russia needs to leave these territories. Now, what I'm saying is that being a demand currently while Russia is on the advance and occupied this amount will have a negotiation fall over at that point, because you can see that of some of these oblasts that Russia occupy, the majority of it, in the sake of Crimea, all of it, in the sake of Luhansk, basically all of it. And it's a pretty strong demand to make if there was a negotiation, that you need to leave areas of which you occupy almost 100%, or in some cases 100% of, without then a military victory pushing at least that back over 50% that you've liberated. So this is going to be relevant in those peace negotiations and what chops and changes could occur in this. So I think that is interesting to look at as well. Now, held up enough of your time, let's actually have a look at the map. And we're down here in Avdiivka, and you will see straight off the bat that there are significant Russian gains made around Prohez, Vesely, and what they are trying to do here is fatten this out. And what we have seen, and I call it the sausage maneuver, is move out in one direction and then try and fatten that out to reduce your risk of being cut off. So we can see, let's look at this, Yevnahivka, Prohez, this is the sausage evolving here. Then we'll skip forward and it's starting to fatten out. And this is what we've seen around New York as well. And what we know, that Russia is pushing for really two objectives in here: this intersection and Pokrovsk back here too. So we will go and have a look exactly at this and look where the map's lining up. But Zelensky has said this today: Russian forces are concentrating the largest number of personnel, the largest numbers of weapons and fabs, everything they have in the Pokrovsk direction. So we know this is where Russia's main effort is currently, although being attritional war, that there are many main efforts along the front line to try and disperse then Ukrainian forces. So some interesting things here, and we'll look at where then the defensive works are sitting and what that tells us about what is happening in here. So Syriac maps today. Again, these two maps have been very similar over the past few weeks. Again, these map to deep state from Syriac to deep state, to my eyes, showing basically very similar, except a fill-in of this paddock down here, grey zone, that will be filled in anyway. So again, we can confirm that that's where those movements were made. But what I spoke about the other day and what I want to show you again is this is grinding forward very slowly, and many will say it's moving too slowly, the winning too slowly, so to speak, in here. Although attritional warfare, that's how things work. Even you can be winning by moving backwards or sitting still as well in attritional warfare, and that is what Ukraine is, at least messaging, putting out is, no, we are moving backwards, but by the losses that Russia is taking, we have the advantage by wearing them down. Now, the numbers of soldiers Ukraine released that they have killed of Russia would show that, but I do bring into question those numbers and how much can be lost when we're looking at defensive lines too. So there's a few guys that do defensive lines and they do cop a lot of flack. So Clement Molan and this JJ Helen as well. So just to shout out, this is the map that I'm using of his today. So this is where we see Avdiivka or the Pokrovsk now front, and where this is trying to have an advantage. Now, what he has done here is he's basically overlaid the deep state map onto then his map, and where he has mapped the defensive works. Now, what is blaringly obvious and straight off the bat is the amount of defensive works since Avdiivka that have been pushed through. Of course, it will slow down this advancement greatly. The amount that still remain between where the front line is around Prohez and Pokrovsk, the amount that are still in here, but that these do get more and more scarce as well. Now, what I've spoken about is this is grinding forward very, very slowly, but this may also speed up a lot. I want to jump then across onto his map, Oshadatne, Prohez, front. This is Pokrovsk here, and you can see the amount of defensive works and how slowly this may advance through these areas, as it has through these heavily defended works already. But like we've spoken about, that once it moves, if it gets to Pokrovsk and potentially then behind these areas, it may speed up a lot. And the next area we'll talk about is New York, and we'll look at where these defensive works between the Toretsky and New York front, if they get enveloped in here, Ukraine will have to withdraw out of them, not even fight from those defensive works in many cases. Of course, these in here have been sitting for 10 years, but we'll speak about that in a second. And I believe this is a very important element of the conflict to talk about, is these defensive works. And you can see, especially in the south, the massive buildup of the defensive works lines. And in my opinion, I think in many of these fronts, I don't believe that the Russians or the Ukrainians currently have the manpower, the motivation, the weapon systems, or the command who's willing to lose the amount of troops that it would actually take to break through to the north or break through from the south, regardless of the patches worn on the arm. Now, I could be incorrect on that. I just don't see any way other than a huge, costly attacks through. You can't outmaneuver these massive defensive works that are sighted in with experienced guys now too. So let's look at what then Syriac says about here. After the arrival of numerous reinforcements in the past 2 weeks, the Russian advance towards Pokrovsk has accelerated. The Ukrainian defences are starting to fall more easily due to shortage of personnel. In addition, in order to reduce losses, Russian forces are carrying out enveloping movements with the aim of forcing the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from these positions while subjecting them to heavy shelling. The strategy, reminiscent of that applied to the Syrian army's Tiger forces during the fight against the IS and opposition groups in Aleppo and Idlib. Less than 10 Ks now separate the Russians from the first houses of Minorad. So this is what we are talking about as this does then move forward. And at this point, the Russians are further away from Avdiivka, where the year started, from Pokrovsk, with potentially less defensive works between, and those fabs coming into play and those fabs not being able to be stopped. And what I've said is if the F-16s can't have a large effect or any effect on those Su-34s, this grind will continue And what we don't know is we do not know the losses that are being incurred by the Russian forces as they move forward. I'm getting told this again and again. Always the saying is, well, the Russians are losing so many guys grinding forward that everything will collapse for them. They'll have to stop at one point. Now, the numbers released by Ukraine or Ukrainian bloggers do suggest this, but what I say is, one, it's impossible to confirm those, and I do bring into doubt that those numbers when we see what advantages does Russia have on the battlefield currently. Okay, they've got an artillery advantage, that's objectively true. They have the FAB advantage, that is objectively true. They have the defensive positions are more in depth and more built. That is objectively true, although the front line is working outside of those defensive works, but still in the rear they are more built up and more in depth as well. And what is subjectively true, depending on who you speak to and where it is, but is that they have the drone advantage as well. And with those factors in play, I struggle to believe that there is a 10 to 20 to 1 advantage of losses on the front line in Ukraine's favour. It doesn't add up to me, but I'm happy to be wrong. More than happy to be wrong in any of this. Now, before we look at these areas, let's look at what the Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi has said over the past day on his Telegram. Fast 3 days, we worked in Eastern Front, in the brigades, defence of Kharkiv and Donetsk. The enemy continues to concentrate its efforts in the Pokrovsk direction, throws its most experienced assault units into battle, trying to break through our defences in the direction of Pokrovsk. Like we spoke about, fierce fighting continues in Kupiansk. We are holding our positions. A difficult situation in Seversk. The enemy actively uses artillery to conduct assaults but has no successes. Fierce battles are taking place in the area of Chasiv Yar without changing positions of the parties. According to the maps, we haven't seen those changing positions. They're in New York, they're trying to storm positions, and in Kharkiv near Holiboki involved chance there are battles, but there's no success or significant, as they suffer significant losses, and we're not seeing too much change up around Volchansk from this map, but we do see a Ukrainian change on Syriac map. But continue on what Syrskyi has said. Combat operations of varying intensity continue all direction of the enemy's offensive, in some places at the cost of heavy losses. The enemy has little success. Tactical positions of the troops may change several times throughout the day, and that's something I've spoken about as well. Like when I was in Kharkiv, we were in areas, I said, well, tonight this will be occupied by Russia, and through the day it's out so you can be here filming. Well, it's a wild thing to think about, but that is what occurs. But in this direction, Russia is having a lot of success, regardless of how you look at it. Now, no changes shown on this map today around New York, Donetsk front, but like we spoke about, this is becoming a bit of an envelopment here for the defensive works that these are very important ones, and they've been here for 10 years as well, of how this will look overall between here and Chasiv Yar as well. Of course, the main efforts in here for Russia, what they really want, Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and Konstantinivka. As you can see, that's obvious. The Ukrainians obviously know this because of the depth of their defensive works to protect those areas. So let's have a look at New York. And Syrskyi says a very similar thing to what I said the other day, but I've got a differing opinion again. What he shows is more push from then this northern part of New York and the southern part of Zelezny in here as well, saying that there's now 3.4 kilometre gap between these two. Now, what I've said is it's a little bit more complex than that, because you've got then these water reservoirs in here that you need to discount some of this territory in the middle too. Yes, you can come out through where my cursor is or through in here where my cursor is, but this does present a challenge to the forces in here as well. Tree lines, water lines, things like that, of where you have cover or where you can't maneuver, that also matters. Russian army made new advances in the eastern part of New York. Meanwhile, Ukrainian army launched counterattack and recaptured some positions in this street. As we can see just in here, Ukraine, by this map, has taken back some ground. On the other hand, Russian forces reached the last houses of Zelezny at the southwest, with his advance only 3.4 kilometres remains to join the axis of New York. Now, as well, gaining the last houses in here is important also, because if you're still in urban centres, your guns and your firing positions are not going to have open rain over open territory, cutting off areas. But if you're at the last houses, you may have that range as well. There's all these factors that need to be thought about when we look at how important one maneuver is over another maneuver. So let's actually just come to the north of here. Nothing's seen around Bakhmut, nothing's seen around Avdiivka. Now, Ryhodka as well, which is just in here. This map shows no changes today, but we did talk about yesterday. Noel reports showed a Ukrainian advancement in here. Now, this is then backed up today with Suryak is showing that Ukraine did have then this successful advancement in this area. Map corrections were made showing Ukrainian army control of the territory that previously showed the territory was probably under control since 2023 when Ukrainian army managed to stop Russian advance there and reversed most of the gains. So we get a map correction in here. So whether this was an advancement or not, but we do know something definitely changed in here because a pro-Ukrainian and then Suryak map, which people will call it pro-Russian, but what I say is it just seems to be very reliable for where areas are made. Regardless, we show multiple maps and just come to the north of here, this northeastern pocket, of course, an area where Russia is trying to push hard, trying to have some effect on Kupiansk, being the center hub for in here. And what this is showing today is near Sinkivka that Russia did have an advancement. And we have seen a lot of pushing in here, not much success over the past 6, 7, 8 months. Continues shelling Sinkivka, its troops advanced to the east of the locality, just down in these positions here, basically what is shown as grey zone here. Now, let's move up into the north on these two fronts where we're not seeing much change at all, still showing this disconnect, which is not going to be disconnected over a month. Now, what we do see here is we had seen claims for a number of days that Russia had crossed the Volga and had some area across into the south here. Now, from this map today, what it's showing is the fighting south. The aggregate plant confirms that Russian troops withdrew from their temporary positions south of Volga River. Meanwhile, Russian army advanced on new high buildings. So saying that they had to have a pushback into the north of the Volga, showing very similar to this in here as well. And in these high buildings in here had some success. That's where we saw that Russian ASF video running through those destroyed high buildings and the level of intensity of fighting, particularly on this front. Now, another very important area is this Uladar front. We did see over this past week that Russia may ground up this tree line heading towards this road, trying to cut off then supplies between Uladar and Konstantinivka, as well with Vodiani as well. So there is Suryak is showing more of this movement today, and by his estimation, he's showing that Russia has done this. Russia may reach the road between here. Again, wait for confirmation across multiple sources, but that is the end of the mapping today, and we'll keep you updated as well with where the fortifications lie as things start maneuvering and moving around. Now, F-16s, that has been the big thing of the past 24 hours, people releasing merch and bloody everything. But a lot of saying that this photograph, is a doctored image. And what I'll say is, well, it doesn't really matter. We've got confirmation that the F-16s are in Ukraine. Some are claiming they have done their first combat operations. I'm unsure, but either way, we know that they're there. Now, this bloke is the president of the European Movement International. He's done the infamous words, the words we're not allowed to use, game changer of a weapon system. And what I've said is I doubt that if it is 6 at the moment, I don't know how much change that is actually going to have on the front line. The fighter jet itself is an Uber or a taxi for a weapon system. What is more important is what weapon systems are going to be strapped to that and how much easier the flow is going to be between the weapon system and the sensors aboard the aircraft itself. But wait and see, and time will tell us exactly how these will work. But as far as the long-range systems, your Storm Shadows, your Scalps, whatever, that's going to have no massive change off the bat. Some air-to-air systems may. We will see. But we do have a number, and this is saying from the Times that a source familiar with the matters told Time that 6 jets had been supplied. That was a number we heard about a week ago, and that we're expecting that more aircraft will come in the coming months, but we are then unsure. Now, what I would be saying if I was Ukraine, if I was Zelensky, I'd be saying, we hear all this messaging from the West about we stand with you, all our support, this and that, and you've got thousands of these things. Some of them are sitting rotting away, and we've got 6. and we have 10, 20 pilots, doesn't really equal B on this. But I do want to say with the F-16s, a great aircraft, but those who are speaking and speculating about F-16s conducting CAS, so close air support on the front line, we are further from that than ever with the complexity of the front line, from man-pads, from air defense systems, from Russian planes as well. An F-16 conducting close air assault with the machine gun on the bloody thing would only take place at a complete decimation of all Russian air defense systems, ground-based, air-based systems. We are incredibly far away from that occurring. So I've seen a lot of people going, well, the gun on it will fire on. That's a long way from happening. We're not even sure if these will fly up into the east or northeast of the country yet. What we're being told, and what I agree with, is it's most likely going to be used in an air defense role or to launch long-range bombs potentially into Crimea as well. But what I will say on these two, and what a lot of guys I've spoken to, and you can watch back on the receipts of this, is the money versus what will come in the capacity shift for the guys I've spoken to at the front. They're saying that we don't need F-16s. We need more basic systems, that we need good night vision, good thermal. They're the two things that I'm hearing from the guys. It's like, that is what every position needs, is night vision and thermal, and cheap drones. And they're saying the manpower put into having F-16s, the billions of dollars of upgrading everything from airfields to training to the jets to maintenance to ongoing costs, that would have been far better spent rather than on something that will have a change somewhere, maybe, and symbolic, a lot of symbolic value. But what the boys need is night vision, thermals, hearing protection, basic kit like that. And he said if every position had night vision and thermals, you'd see a remarkable change on the front line and areas then moving. But I do think, and I thought about this last night, we could potentially see over the next few days or weeks, this is pure speculation, we could see a large attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge. We know, again, this is symbolically a massive part because it is the physical connection between Crimea and Russia. Now, how much military equipment flows across here? Well, that has been reduced throughout the war due to Russia having then train lines and other ways through the south of Ukraine, and knowing that it is a threat here, as well as the ferries across the Sea of Azov as well. So how much of a military shift will it have? That is questionable, and Ukrainian commanders have said themselves that it's very limited, the military equipment that moves across here, but symbolically huge. And I think for like a stamp of approval, maybe we will see a heap of Storm Shadows or Scalps or something fired upon the bridge in the next coming weeks. Potentially, that it just might be what we see. I'm currently unsure. But again, what I want to say as well is, as we're leading into the end of the year, as you know, there's a lot more talk about things like negotiations, as the front line's shifting, as whatever. One of the things that concerns me, and always concerns me, is I believe there is a huge increased risk to then false flag events as well. So things to keep your eyes open for: false flags and people trying to influence elections. So we will talk about it as things then maybe come or go. Now, we have seen Ukraine operating in other areas around the world, Syria and Africa. Now, Andriy Yusov has emphasized similar things are happening to Russian mercenaries. Of course, this is referring to what happened in Mali last week, in Sudan, Mali, Syria, and there are several other events that did not receive publicity in the media so far. Speaking of publicity in the media, I'm still waiting to see what happened to the Tu-22 aircraft, where those claimed to destroyed. If anyone has any images of that, please, or any more information on that, please send it through. It seems to have gone quiet, but there was some confirmation and satellite images, and send it. My email's below. If you've got something, send it through. Obviously, we're talking about the fact that monopoly in the field of bandit piracy of so-called Russian PMCs in a world where Africa is definitely coming to an end. I don't think we'll ever see an end of this bandit PMC work in Africa ever. Far too many people make too much money off it. Regarding Tuareg Operation in Mali, The number of destroyed Russians is being specified. According to him, there were more prisoners, but some were exchanged immediately on the spot. Information that rebels allegedly want to hand over captured Wagnerites to Ukraine. He said, regarding the sensitive issue, we have to wait. So there has been some speculation of whether they have been held for ransom and can be swapped back or not. We'll wait and see on this. Now, Ukrainian's Prime Minister, he has written on his Telegram regarding what Robert Fico and the Viktor Orban from Hungary have said then about the Lukoil oil crossing through Ukraine from Russia and how that has been switched off and then affecting what it says is energy security. In recent weeks, had a number of conversations with Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico. All of them were in the spirit of our common policy of new pragmatism and all about the energy security of our countries. It's important to understand that Ukraine has insisted and continues to insist on the need to give up Russian oil as much as possible because Russia and energy security are not compatible things. The thing is, it is still one of those things that even after this war, cheap Russian oil and gas will continue to flow into areas around the world, and give it time and it will flow into Europe as well. As we've seen, the costs of that lift up, it will flow. All countries understand this and most act. The EU allowed Slovakia and a number of other countries to use Russian oil on its condition that the countries will actively develop alternate supply channels now, and the majority have. So what they said is, yep, you can continue it, but you need to start looking for outside sources of that to replace them. The Russian stuff, Slovakia and Hungary haven't been able to then replace this due to a number of reasons and internal politics and not wanting to, and cheap oil and gas, that plays into it as well. And Ukraine have turned off the taps. Second, Ukraine remains a reliable transport point for all countries that value freedom and the rule of law. The sanctions introduced by the National Security Council of Ukraine do not pose a threat to the energy security of Slovakia and Europe in general, which is why the cancellation is not the subject of discussion. Therefore, we have a complete understanding of Brussels in this matter. Now, I have a very different view on this. Ukraine would not do this without EU, Brussels having a say on it. The EU, NATO, they have far too much influence into Ukraine and decisions made. I believe that this is the European Union arm twisting Hungary and Slovakia for other decisions. Both the EU, both the NATO, both have veto powers in a number of votes across that. I think that we talk about this, that we do not expect blackmail or threats. I believe it's the other way into Slovakia and Hungary of these being done, that you make energy more expensive and we will help with whatever if you vote yes on this or step out of the room. That's how I read into this. I think it is Ukraine being used in a way and putting the blame onto Ukraine for, turning off the tap, so to speak, to try and have a political advantage to try and bring Hungary and Slovakia basically into line with the remainder of the European Union partners. And this is one of the things about reference groups like the EU and NATO, or let's say EU, you do sacrifice some of your sovereignty and some of your decisions for then the security umbrella of the economic powerhouses and support and trade within that as well. But again, that is where people, if you stick your head of a nail sticks up, you'll get hammered down. Fifth, again, sanctions introduced by Ukraine are not a threat to Slovakia's energy security. That the threat is Russia, its hybrid energy war against Slovak people, and its blackmail and political ultimatums. That said, it's going to be a lot more expensive for these energy systems as well. And that is where Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has said that in Ukraine, Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, it focuses on nuclear energy, not energy in general, because what he says is he points to things like Nord Stream and said, well, that would be a threat to energy. Therefore, it's been specified as nuclear. So there's no one who's directly right or wrong in this, because there's always going to be energy flowing here. But again, a lot of fuel and a lot of energy flow back in from Slovakia and Hungary to Ukraine too. So we'll see how far Orban and Fico are sort of willing to push this. Now, we have seen a large prisoner swap, the largest one since post-Soviet history as well. This just by the ABC. Washington and Moscow at their lowest point since the Cold War. So tensions are the highest. Now, negotiations back-channel talks at one point explored exchanging Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, but after his death in February, ultimately stitched together a 24-person deal that required significant concessions from EU allies, including the release of a Russian assassin, secured freedom of a cluster of journalists, suspected spies, political prisoners, and others. Now, what I will say on Navalny, I don't know. It's one of these things about it doesn't really make sense at that point in time why he would be killed then by the Kremlin. It doesn't like Tucker Carlson does a good part. As much as I disagree with on things about this war with Tucker, he does a good part of like why would that happen at this point? And we know Navalny was an asset as well. Talk about trying to have influence in elections. Well, that's X right there. That's a difficult one. But again, 24 people have been returned to their homes. The US allies gave up Russians charged with convicted of serious crimes in exchange for Russia releasing journalists, dissidents, and other imprisoned by the country's highly politicized legal system on charges seen by the West as trumped up. This is something we have seen. So we swapped over the a warlord that there's a movie about, a Hollywood movie for a WNBA player who brought in some weed into Russia. And that's all people are pointing at is Russia's getting a far better deal out of a lot of this than the West may be getting. Russia knows this. That's why they may, go and, arrest journalists. Therefore, well, for getting X back, we get then A, B, and C. So Sullivan has talked about this in a Q&A at the White House. Jake, I just want to follow up on this interaction with the Russians. I mean, does this lay the groundwork for discussions about the war in Ukraine with the Ukrainians? I mean, just sort of say, look, we cooperated on this. Is there any path that this creates? Any goodwill in terms, creating more discussion? This is what you and I spoke about at the end of yesterday's video. He says, we do not see a link between the hostage negotiation or the detained persons negotiating any potential diplomacy over the war in Ukraine, but we see these operating on separate tracks. That said, what I will say is diplomacy is diplomacy. Whether you're talking about this or you're talking about that, there's still there's definitely now an open diplomatic channel, and that you're willing to come to some sort of agreement, whether it's on a completely separate track from Ukraine. But now we have seen from the absolute lack of any diplomatic channel to now there is at least something open there. One is really about the practical issue of producing this exchange. The other is more complex question whether Ukrainians will be in the lead. They may be in the lead on the face, but the US can absolutely influence when, how, and if that decision is made. The US will consult closely with our allies to support them when they're prepared to step forward and engage in those in any kind of diplomacy. So, again, we will definitely see. Legends, look after yourself. Have a fantastic day. I may or may not see you over the weekend. It depends. Anyway, I'll speak to you then. Bye-bye.